My name is Terry Olson. I serve in the School of Family Life and as a fellow in the Wheatley Institution. I'm grateful to conduct this session and to get Dr. Wilcox on the runway. We ask all of you, since we are recording this, to please turn off your cell phones. My experience has been that when I make that request, it's primarily, one of its functions is, for those of you that will forget to do that, it just doubles your embarrassment when your phone goes off. But because we are recording it, we'd ask you to bypass that embarrassment if at all possible and go ahead and turn off the phones, in spite of the fact that you heard me just ask you to do so. Our format for today is following Bradford Wilcox's presentation. We'll have 5 to 6 minutes of commentary, reaction from first David Dollahite, Dave Frazier, of the School of Family Life, and Stan Knapp, the Department of Sociology. And then we will open the floor to questions. Because, again, we are recording this, we ask that you go to the microphone over to your right and make it a question that you are asking. I am the gendarme of time as well, and while I will only be able to give eyebrow signals to Dr. Wilcox and want him to take the time necessary, I will also be the one that turns on and shuts off the questions as we go. We're pleased to introduce Dr. Wilcox, who is no stranger to BYU nor to the National Council on Family Relations, our professional organization. His work as the director of the National Marriage Project, which the University of Virginia hosts, does have national implications, has generated both appreciation and consternation among various entities across the United States. We're grateful that he's willing to commit and go forward and endure, if not promote, the notion of the value of that project. He's a member of the James Madison Society at Princeton University. His PhD was at the University at Princeton. He's been an associate of, over the years, teaching research fellowships at Princeton, Yale University, and the Brookings Institution. His home now, as I identified, is the University of Virginia. His topic, Why Marriage Matters, a Natural Law Perspective on Marriage and Family Life. Please welcome Dr. Wilcox.
Thanks, Terry. It's a pleasure to be back here at BYU. Since its founding, the United States has been marked by an unprecedented appreciation for religious pluralism, freedom of conscience, and rugged individualism. Now, don't get me wrong. These are great American achievements, as we all know, but they can and have presented our nation with challenges when confronting difficult and divisive questions regarding how to order our common life together. When we don't agree about our deepest values, when we think individuals should be able to reach their own conclusions about the moral life, and when we put a premium on individual freedom, this country of ours has often stumbled when it comes to tackling moral questions that bear on the commonweal. Now, in our day and age, marriage has become one such issue. How are we to think about an institution that simultaneously touches on some of our deepest personal desires, as well as some of our society's most important public concerns, from the welfare of children to the sexual desires of adults? It's for precisely a divisive issue such as marriage that we are most in need of a public philosophy that is accessible to all reasonable men and women of goodwill, and that doesn't depend on a commitment to one religious or secular creed. As John Courtney Murray has argued, and we hold these truths, natural law provides one such public philosophy for a nation such as our own, that is in need of a common ethic that is not specifically rooted in one religious tradition. What then is natural law? Well, in brief, to quote from Cicero, natural law, quote, is the highest reason implanted in our human nature, which prescribes those things which ought to be done and forbids the contrary, unquote. Or to put it another way, the natural law tradition holds that we can use our reason to draw conclusions about the good life that can then be explained to all reasonable men and women of goodwill. Now, in my talk today, I'm going to point out some of the ways in which contemporary social scientific research on the family is largely in concord with both classic and contemporary natural law thinking about marriage. More specifically, I'll reflect on the ways in which a natural law perspective fits with what we now know scientifically about how marriage matters and why marriage matters to children and to the larger common weal. This is an important undertaking because the state of our unions is not strong. Okay, it's not strong. Over the last 40 years, of course, this nation has witnessed a dramatic retreat from marriage, marked by increases in divorce, in non-marital childbearing, in cohabitation, and in fatherlessness. And as a consequence, the institution of marriage is now less likely to guide the adult life course, to be the primary context for the bearing and rearing of children. And it's less likely to provide an anchor of social stability to our nation's communities. Take divorce, for instance. From the 1960s to the present, the divorce rate more than doubles in this country, to the point where about 43% of first marriages are ending in divorce. So clearly marriage is not providing kind of a stable context for adult relationships. Or take non-marital childbearing. Back in 1960, only 5%, 5 in 100 kids, were born outside of marriage. Today, more than 4 in 10 kids are born outside of marriage, 41% according to the most recent estimate. So clearly marriage is not the sort of most powerful context that it used to be for the bearing of children. Or take cohabitation. We had only about 400,000 couples cohabiting back in 1960. Now it's actually close to 7.2 million couples. And what we're also seeing, of course, is that about 2/3 of couples are cohabiting prior to marriage, and that number seems to be growing every year. So cohabitation has emerged as a kind of key competitor to marriage when it comes to how we think about co-residence and even childbearing. And all of this, of course, is associated with a growth in fatherlessness, where about 25% of kids now are in a home without a father or a social father, as this slide suggests. So when we put all these trends together, in my view, the most consequential development associated with all of this, with all this family change in our country, is that more kids are growing up apart from an intact biological married family. So back in 1960, about 80% of kids were growing up with both their married mom and dad. And when they didn't have that privilege, it was often because one of their parents had died. By contrast, today only 45% of kids are being raised by their biological parents in a married context. So a big change here, obviously, for kids in terms of their exposure to the intact biological married family. Now, when you kind of review these family trends in the academy, in the Guild, and with many journalists, often kind of the view about this is that the family is just changing, that we can kind of celebrate a sort of colorful mosaic of different types of families. So the family in this view isn't endangered, it's just changing. In fact, the question becomes, from this type of perspective, why should we care about the kinds of family changes that I've just talked about in our larger social context? Well, we should care because we now know from a very large body of research that kids in non-intact homes are 2 to 3 times more likely to experience serious negative outcomes, things like delinquency, depression, dropping out of high school. And on average, about 10% of kids who are in biological married families will experience these types of outcomes, compared to between 20 and 30% of children who are in cohabiting or in step or in single-parent families. So one important point, of course, here to note, and I should say this also as someone who was raised by a single mother, who I think actually did a pretty good job with me and with my sister, that most kids who are reared outside of an intact family turn out kind of okay on most social outcomes. But I'm also a sociologist. And as a sociologist, I think it's important for us to sort of understand that we're increasing the risks that our kids face when we raise them outside of an intact married family. And that at kind of a larger social level, communities, neighborhoods, states, and nations bear large costs at the collective level when families break down. So the bigger point here is that when we think about this question, how does marriage matter, that the evidence suggests to us that intact biological marriage is still the gold standard. It's kind of a gold standard here at the bottom of this slide, for those of you who can see it in the audience. And just to kind of illustrate to you what these studies look like in the scientific literature, I'm going to have a few slides to kind of give you a sense of what we're discovering in the social sciences about the importance of family structure. So my mentor at Princeton, Sarah McClanahan, a leading sociologist in this country, did a study looking at the impact of family structure on young men's odds of ending up in prison at some point before they turned 32. So it could have been a night in prison for kind of a wild night in the town, or it could be life in prison for first-degree murder here. But what you can see in this slide is that young men who grow up in a single-parent family, and a family headed by a single mother, are about twice as likely to end up in jail compared to their peers who grow up in a two-parent family with their father. So clearly, having a two-parent family, having a father in the household is linked to establishing a climate of order and authority in the home that helps set young men, helps set teenage boys on the right path. But it's important for us to understand and to acknowledge that it's not just boys who benefit from a two-parent family, it's also girls. What we see in the literature, among other things, is that girls who are raised in a home with their father are much more likely to delay the onset of sexual activity or to remain virgins before they get married. And of course, they're much more likely also not to have a teenage pregnancy. And what this particular study shows us, this is Bruce Ellis at the University of Arizona, is that girls whose fathers leave before they turn 6 are about 7 times more likely to have a teenage pregnancy compared to girls who are fortunate enough to grow up with their dad throughout their entire childhood. So clearly dads are important, kind of establishing a certain kind of emotional climate in the household, and also in kind of steering their daughters away from young men or from teenage boys who don't have their best interests at heart. Then when it comes to education, we see in the literature that kids who have an intact two-parent family are more likely to graduate from high school and to go on and graduate from college, as this slide indicates. So we see in this particular slide is that young adults who have been raised in an intact family are about twice as likely, even after controlling for things like income and education and race, they're about twice as likely to graduate from a university or a college like BYU. So I think most Americans, regardless of their political orientation, would acknowledge that education is an important good. And clearly this slide suggests to us that family structure has a lot to do with whether or not our nation's children, our nation's young adults, are able to pursue the good of education. Now, I've been focusing in these first couple of slides primarily on kind of the contrast between single parents and two parents. And given that sort of focus, and given also the fact that cohabitation is becoming a much more common context for the bearing and rearing of children, I think it's helpful for us to sort of step back here and think about, well, how does this story play out with respect to cohabitation? Because you have in that context, of course, two adults in the household. And so maybe kids who are being raised by cohabiting parents, be they biological or step parents, if you will, turn out okay. And so more precisely, we know about 21% of kids in the US today are being born to cohabiting couples. In fact, a lot of the big increase since the 1980s in non-marital childbearing can be attributed to the fact that more and more couples today are cohabiting and having kids in these cohabiting relationships. But it's also the case, too, that there are lots of kids who will spend time in a cohabiting union because their own parents either divorce or break up. And then often the case is that their mom lives with a boyfriend who is not related to them after that divorce or that breakup. And so the point simply is that more and more kids in this country are spending some time in a cohabiting household. And so we need to understand how this is affecting our nation's children. And the initial research on this particular subject is not encouraging. And I have to be clear here, this is kind of a newer area of research, but what I've seen in this area is pretty consistent in showing us that kids in cohabiting households do worse than kids in intact married families. They're more likely to experience educational failure, to become addicted to drugs, and I think most importantly, to be sexually or physically abused, compared to kids who are living with their biological married parents. And this next slide touches on this last point. This is from the most recent federal study of child abuse and neglect, which was published last year. And it shows you different bars for different family types. Now, if you look at this particular slide, I'm just going to actually walk over here for a second. These bars here, here, and here are referring to kids who are living with their biological mother and their mother's boyfriend. So they're in cohabiting households where they are not living with their biological father, living with an unrelated male. And what you can see from these different bars is that kids who are living in these cohabiting contexts are much more likely to be physically abused, to be sexually abused, and to be emotionally abused. So there's clearly a connection here between cohabitation and the abuse of our children in this country. What's, I think, also striking about this particular slide is you can see that every deviation from the gold standard, in fact, actually in the report, the gold standard here is the intact biological married family. You can see this is the safest place to be for physical abuse, for sexual abuse, and for emotional abuse. And in fact, one of the most powerful studies here comes from a study that was done on the link between family structure and the fatal abuse of kids, of preschoolers in Missouri. And what this particular study found was that kids who were living with their mom and an unrelated boyfriend, their mom's boyfriend, were more than 45 times more likely to be killed in that context compared to kids who were living in an intact biological married family. So the point here, to kind of quickly summarize a very large body of research on the welfare of kids, is that when marriage disappears, as it is in much of our culture, children are less likely to thrive and they're less likely to survive. Okay? So less likely to thrive and to survive when marriage disappears. So as we think about this body of research, kind of from a kind of more broader philosophical or natural law perspective, what I think we can argue here is the primary reason that the state accords a special legal status to marriage is that marriage is the cross-cultural institution that best ensures that kids are supported financially, socially, and emotionally by their mother and their father. But I also want to just be clear here. Marriage also has benefits for adults, for communities, and for the state itself. And I'm just going to quickly touch on those points in the next few slides. When it comes to adults, basically we know that adults who marry and stay married tend to end up healthier, wealthier, and safer. There are some gender differences here. Men benefit more when it comes to their health and their income. Women benefit more when it comes to their wealth and their safety. So there are some, once again, some gender differences, but the point is that both men and women benefit, on average from getting and staying married. And the slide here gives you more details on things like that men, for instance, live about 10 years longer than their unmarried peers. And so the benefit of marriage is about as strong for men as the benefit of not smoking for men. And of course, we think, to go back to Catherine's lecture today, about all the focus in our society on smoking. And it's an important focus. But it's interesting that we don't have that same kind of focus on the value of marriage, given the kinds of results I'm talking about here in this slide. But it's also important to recognize that the strength of marriage has a big impact on our communities and our nation as a whole. So we know, for instance, from work that's been done at the Brookings Institution, that virtually all of the growth in our country in child poverty since the early 1970s can be attributed to the retreat from marriage, and specifically to the fact that kids are now much less likely to be living in a household with their father, and therefore they're much less likely to get access to his economic resources. And on the crime front, we know that households that have a married father in the household are not only safer for themselves, but they tend to foster safer communities when you've got a lot of intact families in a given neighborhood or a given community. And so when marriage breaks down in a community as a whole, you see crime kind of creeping in. And we have here, for instance, one of our nation's leading criminologists, Bob Sampson at Harvard, saying this, quote, "Family structure is one of the strongest, if not the strongest, predictors of urban violence across cities in the United States." Okay, so the point here is that the strength, the integrity, the power of marriage has implications for the welfare of communities and for the nation as a whole. And then a related point is that the government incurs a host of welfare, of educational, of criminal, and medical costs when the family breaks down. And one recent study from Georgia State suggests that the federal government spends at least an extra $112 billion every year because of the retreat from marriage. I think that's a very conservative estimate. They were trying to be very careful in this particular study. But the bigger story here is that when marriage breaks down, when the family breaks down, the state, in effect, becomes the provider for women and children, oftentimes, in single-parent families, and, as we've seen, the protector of the society and of communities against boys who are being reared in homes without their fathers. So these are some of the ways in which we can see that marriage matters for the welfare of children, for adults, for communities, and for the polity itself. So I've talked about how marriage matters. Let me talk now about why it is that marriage is needed, why it's so important. And the point I want to make here is that marriage is the ideal context for the bearing and rearing of children, in part because the institution of marriage supplies remedies to three enduring vulnerabilities associated with the human condition. And it does so as an institution with a host of social practices and norms that lend strength and stability to family life. So I've listed the three vulnerabilities here on this slide, relating to infants, to men, and to women. I'll talk about them more in a second. Before I do that, I want to just make the point about marriage as an institution. And of course, we're all familiar with Mae West's line about marriage. She said, "Marriage is a great institution, but I'm not ready for institution." So even Mae, with all of her flaws, had a kind of an appreciation for marriage that unfortunately many Americans today don't have. Okay, but what's the point here? Well, the point is that the institution of marriage, qua institution, supplies a set of cultural norms, supplies a set of common social practices that are then assembled together into particular roles that do a number of things for us as a society and as a nation. The first thing that they do for us is they give us a certain sense of order, a certain template, if you will, in terms of how to conduct ourselves in some very important areas. That is in the areas of sex, in the areas of child rearing, and in the areas of sort of providing for the common welfare, if you will. And they do this by achieving certain functions, by doing things like tempering male sexuality, by providing the ideal context for child rearing, and by fostering a spirit of mutual aid between spouses and then between kin more generally. Okay. And all this is valuable because of I think, three important vulnerabilities that have come out both in sort of the classic and contemporary thinking, and part natural law thinking about marriage and family life. And the first point here is that as a species, as Don Browning notes, we have infants who are extremely vulnerable, quote, due to their long dependency on adult care in comparison with other mammalian newborns. So the point here simply is that our species has highly vulnerable, highly dependent infants, toddlers, and even young kids who require a lot of care and a lot of resources. And Thomas Aquinas also recognized this reality. He said the human female is, quote, far from sufficing alone for the rearing of children, since the needs of human life require many things that one person alone cannot provide, unquote. So the point is that both kind of classic and contemporary thinkers, natural law thinkers in part, have recognized that the human being has infants and young children who need a lot of resources, and it helps us to figure out a way as a society, as a culture, to bring in at least one other adult in an institutionalized manner to help with the care of kids. And so more concretely, the institution of marriage has emerged in society after society after society to connect fathers to the mothers of their children, thereby adding vital paternal, material, social, and emotional resources to the child-rearing enterprise. Okay? So bottom line here is that marriage helps to bring men into the picture, and that's really important given the vulnerability of infants and children. A second point that comes out in the literature and is, I think, very nicely articulated by Don Browning more recently is that we have a second vulnerability, if you will, in the human condition that Browning calls the male problematic, by which he means, quote, the tendency of men to drift away from families, unquote, either by disengaging from their families or by going from one woman to the next, okay? The point here is not that all men obviously do this, but there's a certain kind of temptation that men face in this regard that has to be addressed. So marriage addresses this problematic by stressing the importance of virtues like sexual fidelity and marital permanence. And as my late colleague Stephen Knock has pointed out, men are encouraged to resist the temptation to be either lone rangers or to be cads by getting status from the larger community for being good and faithful husbands. So what my colleague Stephen Knock would say is that we can't underestimate the power of the marital vow, of the marriage ceremony, and of marriage more generally in motivating men to do right by their families, is to kind of take into account their standing in a community of friends and family members. The other important point here, though, is that insofar as marriage reinforces monogamy, it affords men with a sense of paternal certainty. This is a point that actually Aquinas also writes about. This is important because men are more likely to invest in their own biological children and to temper their own aggressive and sexual instincts around children when they have a very clear sense that the kids in their household are their own. Okay? So marriage helps to connect men by giving them a sense of confidence. The kids in their home are their own children. Browning also observes a third vulnerability in the human condition, in what he calls the female problematic, which is in part the tendency of women to think that they can, quote, raise children without paternal participation. Okay? So the idea here is that some women think that they can kind of do it on their own. Okay? But the research, of course, suggests that women are not as likely to succeed when they treat parenting as a solo enterprise. And marriage has historically addressed this problematic through norms of fidelity, of marital permanence, and legitimacy. But it's also addressed this by creating a context, typically, for the exchange of mutual aid and material assistance between partners, between fathers and mothers. This is particularly important for women when they're devoting large amounts of time and energy to the care of infants and toddlers, because they often, in this particular moment in the life cycle, have less of an opportunity to attend to their own provision and that of their children. So the point here is that marriage has also kind of cultivated a kind of mutual dependency, practical and economic dependency, which makes women more appreciative of the importance of keeping dad in the picture. Now, of course, this idea that dads are important has come into question in a number of venues, both academic and legal. Most recently, for instance, in federal court, where Judge Von Walker had this to say, quote, "It's beyond any doubt that parents' genders are irrelevant to children's developmental outcomes," unquote. So he is claiming that we really needn't worry too much about having dads still in the picture. And what his comments suggest is that he is either ignorant of or unwilling to acknowledge a body of research that suggests that dads play a key role in providing for their families, in disciplining their kids, in playing with their children, in challenging their children, and in loving the mother of their children. I'm just going to spend a second here on the third item, that is play. What we know from the literature on dads and play is that fathers are much more likely than mothers to engage their infants, toddlers, and teens in vigorous, physical, and exciting forms of play and games. Dads are more likely, for instance, to be found throwing their toddlers into the air in parks, okay, or kicking a soccer ball with their teenage son or daughter. And this vigorous style of play is important because it promotes social skills, intellectual development, and a sense of self-control. The playful side to fathers teaches their kids how to regulate their feelings and behavior as they interact with others. And engaging in rough physical play with dad teaches children how to deal with aggressive impulses and physical contact without losing control of their emotions. For instance, one study found that father-child play taught kids to recognize others' emotions and to regulate their own emotions. And as University psychologist John Snary wrote, quote, "Children who roughhouse with their fathers usually quickly learn that biting, kicking, and other forms of physical violence are not acceptable," unquote. And I can attribute to the truth of that from my own personal experience. Okay. So the point here, more generally, is that kids who play more often with their dads are not only more popular in school, but they tend to do better in a range of social contexts. So in other words, the lessons children learn playing with their fathers prepare them well for the game of life. Now, when it comes to this issue, finally, of cohabitation, in terms of understanding why it's not as effective as a context or habitat for the rearing of children, the big point here is that cohabitation is not as helpful because it's not institutionalized. Cohabiting unions don't have the same level of commitment, trust, sexual fidelity. They also experience more violence than married couples. And because they don't have this normative and this social and this legal support for their relationships, we see a lot more instability in cohabiting unions. And instability, we're learning more and more every day, is bad for kids. Of course, any of you who have a 3-year-old would know that stability is a good thing, but academics are now discovering this new idea that kids actually thrive in stable contexts, and cohabitation does not provide that stability. So, for instance, one recent study found that kids who were born into biological, married, and cohabiting contexts had very different experiences of stability. So the kids who were born into cohabiting contexts were about 3 times more likely to see their parents break up before they turned 5, compared to kids who were born into a married household. So clearly there's a link here between stability and marriage, which cohabitation does not achieve. The other point I want to make is about adoption. And I have to say here that adoption does play a signal role in helping kids who don't have biological parents to raise them. And I'm the father of 5 adopted kids, and so I think adoption is a wonderful institution. But it's important for me, once again, as a sociologist, to acknowledge that it's not as ideal as the intact biological married family, because on average, kids who are raised in adoptive homes are more likely to have difficulty with things like conduct problems, with things like depression, with things like substance abuse. And this next slide comes from a recent report from the Institute for American Values called My Daddy's Name is Donor. And one of the things that comes out in this report is that kids or young adults who are reared in adoptive homes are more likely to have problems with the law, to seek out psychological counseling, and to have problems with substance abuse compared to kids who are reared by their biological married parents. So even though adoption is a beautiful and important thing in our society and in many societies, it still is not clearly, kind of the ideal on average for kids compared to the intact biological married family. So to kind of bring this together, what we've learned this afternoon is that two parents typically do better than one parent, that mothers and fathers typically bring different talents to the parenting enterprise, that married parents typically do better than cohabiting parents, and that biological parents typically do better than non-biological parents. And I've used the word typically over and over again just to be careful here, because when you're engaged in public debates on this question of family, people will challenge you and say, well, I know this particular family that does a great job, that doesn't kind of meet the gold standard. Of course, there are plenty of families like that. But my point to you today is that on average, these different families are not as successful as the intact biological married family. So to date, the social science suggests the following reasonable conclusion, and that is that the gold standard for the bearing and rearing of children is the biological intact married family. And so my conclusion here is kind of in keeping with a conclusion that was recently articulated by Robert George in a recent piece on marriage. And he said there with his colleagues that, quote, marriage has its characteristic structure largely because of its orientation to procreation. It involves developing and sharing one's body and whole self in the way best suited for honorable parenthood, permanently and exclusively, unquote. So I think what you can see here is that the sort of the classic purpose and function of marriage is about trying to integrate biology, social conventions, law, et cetera, into one package, which is the intact married family. And that's, that's sort of, it's developed across time and place in many, 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 many societies because it serves the welfare of children. Now, what's striking here is that as we kind of compare kind of classic and contemporary thinking from a natural law perspective about marriage and family, you can see how it actually parallels some work that's been done by recent family scholars, including, once again, Sarah McClanahan, my mentor at Princeton, and her colleague, Gary Senefer at the University of Wisconsin, who wrote back in 1994, after doing a lot of research on the impact of divorce and single parenthood on kids, they wrote the following. They said, quote, if we were asked to design a system for making sure that children's basic needs were met, we'd probably come up with something quite similar to the two-parent ideal. Such a design in theory would not only ensure that children had access to the time and money of two adults, it also would provide a system of checks and balances that promoted quality parenting. The fact that both parents have a biological connection to the child would increase the likelihood that the parents would identify with the child and be willing to sacrifice for that child. And it would reduce the likelihood that either parent would abuse the child, unquote. So you can see here how what's happening in the social scientific world really is, in many respects, in concord with our natural law thinking about, about marriage and family. So to conclude, given the clear economic, social, and emotional benefits of marriage for children, adults, and the nation, we need to renew the economic, the legal, the civic, and the cultural foundations of marriage. If you've been listening to me carefully this afternoon, you now know that our support for the renewal of marriage in this nation is not predicated on some atavistic, particularistic religious worldview. Rather, it's based upon an eminently reasonable understanding of the human condition that is accessible to all men and women of goodwill. And I hope, finally, that the knowledge that our cause is a reasonable one will give all of you confidence in making clear and compelling arguments in the public square on behalf of the institution of marriage. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wilcox. We are grateful for your declarations and the documentation. We'll ask first for 5 minutes of comments from Dr. David Dollahide of the School of Family Life. He will be followed by Dr. Stan Knapp of the Department of Sociology, both at BYU. And then the questions that you would have for Dr. Wilcox, remember, will be offered from the microphone to your right. And we'll proceed with Dr. Dahlheit.
Well, it's so great to have Brad Wilcox with us. You're all fortunate to be able to hear him, and I encourage you, if you're not familiar with his published research, to Google W. Bradford Wilcox and read some of his great, really, really world-class, first-rate scholarship that he's published in very high-quality journals. And also, he has authored a number of pieces in very prominent newspapers and magazines where he's raised the kinds of issues that he's raised to you, to millions of readers throughout the country. So I really encourage you to become more familiar with his work. He really is one of the most influential marriage and family scholars in America today, and I hope that you'll get to know his work better. I'm going to have a little comedic aside here. Because of BYU basketball player Jimmer Fredette's tendency to dominate other teams by making unbelievable shots and scoring massive amount of points under very strong defense, there's a new phrase that's entered the sports lexicon. When a team gets jimmered, it means that they've had someone dominate them and score from everywhere and score in great abundance. I think Brad Wilcox is a lot like Jimmer Fredette, in that Brad has been successful in publishing a number of articles using very high quality samples, very rigorous methods in very good journals, where he has sort of taken on some pretty pervasively widely held views that are sort of unfavorable to traditional family life, and he has won those debates, and he's had to sometimes go to the mat to get these articles published because the gatekeepers of some of these journals weren't happy with his findings. Let me just give you two of what I could give a number of examples. There was a pervading myth among many that highly religious fathers in more traditional faiths were Bible-thumping, oppressive, distant patriarchs. Many social scientists, many people in the social and behavioral field sort of had that impression because of the way that some social scientists wrote. Brad's very good research showed that, in fact, religious fathers are more involved with their children than non-religious fathers, more nurturing, less likely to abuse their children than non-religious fathers, and a number of other good things that religious fathers are doing. Likewise, there was a pervading impression among many for a while that marriages among, in fact, it was sort of the received wisdom among many social scientists that the fact that highly religious or more religious couples' marriages were likely to last longer, were less likely than non-religious couples or less religious couples to end in divorce. A lot of people talked about how that was probably just because of the institutional pressure put on these couples, and shaming them about divorce and kind of the guilt that these couples might feel if they were divorced. Brad's research found that actually married religious couples' marriages were happier, and the men in those families were more likely to do what Brad called emotion work in the marriages. Both men and women were happier because of the kinds of things that they learned in their religious faiths, and so he kind of blew that sacred cow away as well. So from now on, whenever I see someone come up with a great social science article that kind of defends the traditional family and blows away attacks on the traditional family, I'm going to say that person that the opposition got Bradforded, that Brad just nailed him. Well, I want to raise just a couple of questions, and Brad can. I had four, and he addressed one of them, so I'm just going to mention three. What can students, in particular, who are here with us, what can they do now when they're in school, and what can they do later when they're more established in their own marriages and families and communities? what can they do to strengthen the institution of marriage in America at large and in the communities where they live? In other words, how can they help others to develop what Brad has called a marriage mindset, which he has found among particularly more educated Americans, this sort of this what he calls a marriage mindset. How can these students help others to develop that? Secondly, Brad, in his report that he's drafted, which I hope that you'll look up and read, he discusses some problems with what he calls the soulmate model of marriage that is pervasive now in our culture, which he says raises expectations too high that marriage has to be this incredibly amazing emotional, intellectual union that's always happy and positive and so forth. It raises expectations so high that fewer actually will marry, and it probably contributes to people getting out of marriage when it doesn't fulfill their sort of soulmate expectations. So my question is, what is a more healthy way for us to view marriage? And for example, some have proposed the idea that we ought to think about the good enough marriage, and we ought to be satisfied with just sort of a good enough marriage and not have our expectations too high. Love to hear what Brad feels about that. And lastly, what does your research and your feeling, Brad, about the relationship between religious belief and involvement and the changes that we see in the institution of marriage? So love to hear your thoughts on any of those.
Well, in terms of thinking about what I would say to students at a place like BYU who kind of have the future ahead of them on this question of marriage, I think one key need out there is that we need more social scientists who think like we do. Broadly, I would say that. And so, if you're thinking about an academic career, think carefully about sociology, psychology, and economics would be just one concrete point I would make. But I'd also say that a lot of the attention that pro-family groups get and sort of focus on in the larger public square tends to revolve around the law and public policy questions. And when you look at the empirical research on family change in places like, for instance, in India and Brazil, they have actually pretty good ways of figuring out how TV has impacted family life in those countries, because they can look at actually the diffusion of electricity and of television broadcasting in India and in Brazil. And what they find in those two countries is that there's a very close connection between the extension of TV and the erosion of marriage and fertility in those two countries. My takeaway here, and this builds on Catherine's point as well, is that we need to think a lot more about how we can influence popular culture. And so it means thinking about writing scripts, putting together shows, for instance, for maybe internet YouTube distribution. Okay, but in other words, think about the impact, if you're a creative type, that you might be able to have in the cultural arena. The final thing that I would say too is just to think about, and this is where I think actually the LDS Church has a lot to say to all of us, is that we know from the work, for instance, of Wendell Berry, that one reason we're in this predicament is that we don't have a lot going on oftentimes in our own households in terms of productive activity. There's a lot of consumption going on, consuming media, consuming clothes, et cetera, but we often don't have productive homes where people are making things together as a family, where they're canning, for instance, or making clothes or whatever it might be. And what Wendell Berry tells us, and I think rightly so, is that if you're not kind of practically doing things in the household for one another, you're not developing those dependencies which will sustain you over a lifetime. They'll kind of get you beyond and through the soulmate model that Professor Dolehey just mentioned. So I think we need to think more about cultivating kind of productive capacities in the household to kind of revive, if you will, the household economy. And this is where I think that the LDS Church has a lot to teach the broader culture, on this particular front. Now, with regards to the soulmate question, how do we respond to the soulmate model of marriage and relationships? Well, I think one thing to suggest to people is that they should not really see marriage as a venue for being happy, personally happy. they should think about marriage as an opportunity to serve their spouse and to serve their kids, and that they can kind of achieve excellence through service. And I think, most of us realize that we tend to generate the most happiness when we're trying to actually give of ourselves to others, not get things from other people. And I think this is true, obviously, also for our marriages. So I think my bottom line response there to David Dahlheim is just that we should kind of have an ethic of service as kind of our counter to the soulmate model, and that we can all excel in serving our spouses and or we can aspire to excel in those domains. Now, religion and changing family models. Let me just respond largely here at the level of kind of more sort of a big picture. And I think that what I would argue is that when it comes to sort of religion's response to recent family changes and recent and social changes, is that we have to be careful not to do two things. One is to completely accommodate the larger society, as many religious liberals tend to like to do. But we also can't completely withdraw into our own religious communities, because if we do that, I think we tend to lose the next generation. So there's a kind of a via media, a path where you try to identify the things that really threaten the family, and you keep them out of your communities and out of your homes. But you also acknowledge that there are some things that are worthy of sort of picking up on in the larger culture, and you incorporate those things. So concretely, I think one of the things that evangelicals have done since the 1970s is they recognize that there was a kind of legitimate feminist challenge out there that basically suggested that many husbands, many fathers were not sufficiently emotionally engaged in the lives of their families. And so in an effort to respond to that challenge, many evangelical ministries and pastors encouraged their congregations and challenged their men to engage at the emotional level much more in their families. So that was a kind of innovative step, and I think it was a good one. And it's the kind of thing that we need to encourage in our religious traditions, in our religious communities. So the point here simply is that we need to be discerning about rejecting some things, but also understanding too that there can be a kind of wisdom that takes place in larger society, and that we need to sort of respond creatively, to that wisdom as it emerges.
Well, I'm grateful for Dr. Wilcox and all of his wonderful work and the wonderful presentation that he's given us today, and the excellent work he does in social science. I tend to think pretty theoretically, and so basically I have just one question that maybe Dr. Wilcox can expand upon, and that is to help me understand a little bit better how this presentation of the social science research is connected to a natural law perspective. And that's the basic gist of the question. It seemed to me that in the presentation, the assumption was that it's connected because natural law perspective relies upon an understanding of reason that all people can in some sense share. And so we live in a pluralistic world, and through our reasoning ability, we can come to some kind of common understanding. And that natural law thinking makes this assumption, and in some sense, social science does as well. And maybe Dr. Wilcox can expand on that. I wonder, my own thoughts, maybe they're not coherent. I didn't have access to what was going to be presented until now, so maybe my thoughts aren't very coherent. But in the presentation of social science research, we are examining the correlation between certain conditions and certain outcomes, presumably with an interest in understanding and increasing our knowledge about risk and risk factors, so that through the accumulation of the knowledge of the production of risk, we can presumably take actions to reduce that. And so we see this correlation of certain risks associated with child outcomes and then perhaps with communities. Well, and I think that's wonderful research, and it's probably more interesting for most of us to talk about how can we do that really well. But then if I read, and I'm not a natural law expert, so someone can correct me on this as well. But if I read someone like Robert George's work, it seems like here the use of reason is an attempt to, reason is a means by which we reveal a pre-established order. So for example, my understanding of Dr. George's work, we can reveal that the body and the soul are connected in such a way that if we ever think of sex as of the body as some kind of instrument that a detached and disengaged person can use to enhance or to seek after some kind of pleasure, then there's a certain sense in which reason reveals to us that we've got it wrong. We've misunderstood who we are. And so we can make an argument that, in some sense, that sex outside of marriage, even for people who think that it's fine because we've reduced the risk factors, we've used contraception or something like that so the children won't be harmed or something like that, that's okay. Well, the natural law seems to understand reason not as an instrument that we can go out and ascertain risks and then make decisions on the basis of that, but rather as some kind of faculty that reveals to us something that's kind of pre-established, and therefore natural law perspectives help us dispel illusions that we might be practicing certain illusions. I don't know if that's coherent or not, but it seemed to me Dr. Wilcox presents a complementarity between social science and natural law, and I'm still trying to understand how exactly that works, because maybe the complementarity isn't as strong as maybe it is, maybe it isn't. That's kind of my question. He didn't have that before now, so I don't know what you'll say.
It's a great question, Stan, and I think I'm going to leave some of this for Robbie to take up in a few minutes or later on this afternoon, since he's more of an expert in natural law than I am. But I think my sense here is that you're right to suggest it's not just about kind of thinking reasonably about important social or moral questions. It's also about kind of trying to develop a more holistic conception of the human person and human condition. And that once we kind of have worked that out to a certain degree, we can kind of look around and see how that broader and deeper view of the human condition, the human person, allows us to see things in the social world that we might not otherwise see or see in a particular way. And so, if you look at the thinking, for instance, of Thomas Aquinas on a number of topics related to sex and marriage, fatherhood and family, he's operating, of course, a certain kind of metaphysic, a certain kind of understanding about the human person, human condition, that I don't have the time here to spell out, but that are, I think, quite rich and helpful. And they're indebted to thinkers like Aristotle as well. And what I find amazing about his reflections, 700 years ago or so, is that they seem so consonant with many of the reflections that are given by people in our field, people like Sarah McClanahan, at Princeton. So, I think the point here is that to fully appreciate, in a sense, the perspective that natural law brings to bear on the family, we have to kind of turn to develop a sort of richer conception of the human person and of sociability and of men and women and of children. And I've tried to sort of hint at some of the ways in which I think we can do that, and how the research today in psychology and sociology is sort of reflective or consonant with a lot of that natural thinking. But we really need a much deeper understanding of the human person that natural helps us to achieve, to see how they fit together so nicely.
Some of you have been formulating questions and are non-intimidated by the answers that have already been given. So is someone willing to go to the microphone and in a terribly humble and meek way ask a question? Please, yes, go to the mic, please, sir.
Hello. Is this on? Okay, now it is. All right. First of all, thanks. That was awesome. I really enjoyed it. My name's Chad. I just have a question here. What is it? I know you talked about marriage a lot. Just kind of as a broad term, you talked about the male and the female vulnerabilities. But what is it about marriage that's key as far as the way things fit together between a man and a woman? In other words, what is the sociological perspective on same-gender marriage?
That's a great question, and obviously getting a lot of attention really in the last, well, probably the last decade now. So I think, let me just speak, I guess, more generally about this question of same-sex marriage and same-sex families, because there have been about 40 different studies that have been done on the impact of same-sex couples on kids. And the vast majority of these studies suggest there's really no difference between kids who are reared in a same-sex household and kids who are reared in a heterosexual household. So that's kind of where we stand kind of right now in the social science. But I want to say kind of, three things about that research. One is that from a methodological perspective, it has real limitations. That of those about 40 major studies, only one of them actually is relying upon a large, random, and representative sample of kids from same-sex households. So there's some real methodological limitations associated with this body of research, which in a sense calls into question, at least to a degree, its legitimacy. The second point that I want to make is that, for the reasons that I articulated this afternoon, we would hypothesize that kids who are reared in same-sex households won't do as well on average as kids who are reared in intact biological married families, and really I think particularly for two reasons. One is that they are more likely to experience instability, because we know that the least stable relationship in a number of studies is actually lesbian relationships. And when I first came across this, I was somewhat surprised, because I thought maybe it'd be gay relationships, but in fact it's lesbian relationships. And the issue here, I think, is that women are more likely in heterosexual marriages to initiate divorce, in part because they have, I think, higher expectations for their relationships, but also in part because they can kind of monitor all the ups and downs of their relationship better oftentimes than the husband can or the male partner can. So when you put two women together into an intense personal romantic relationship, there's more opportunity in a sense for friction. That helps, I think, to explain why we see this instability in the literature. So given that instability is bad for kids, I think we'd hypothesize that same-sex households would pose risks to kids. The other point I would make here in general is that, as I suggested today, is that men and women bring somewhat different talents to the parenting enterprise. And so kids who don't have the benefit of, say, the distinctive style of play that I referred to in today's lecture when it comes to having a dad in the home, are likely not to get the benefit of that, complementary parenting style. So for those reasons, among others, I would hypothesize that as we continue to do research in this area, that we will find that much like kids in single-parent families, kids in step families, kids in cohabiting families, and kids in adoptive families, that we'll find, in 5 or 10 years from now, with a much better body of research based upon much better samples, that we'll find that kids in same-sex households have, their own challenges and limitations that we see in other types of non-traditional families.
Okay. Thanks.
If you have additional questions, we ask you to seek out Dr. Wilcox during the break, which will begin now, and we will reconvene here at approximately 3 p.m. We're grateful for your attendance, grateful for your questions, and we're grateful to both the discussants and Dr. Wilcox for this hour. Thank you.